and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great Player. Well, my name is Guy, and in today's episode we're looking at half-elves. That weird and wonderful breed that sits, well, in between somewhere and somewhere else, between two potentially very different species, and gives us something totally unique. Now, before I continue any further, last week or the week before, we did half-orcs. Now we're doing half-elves, and there was a very valid statement made. This is before I even get on with the rest of my list. But the valid statement that was made was, well, you have half-orcs, you have half-elves, half other bits and bobs, but it's generally assumed that it's a monstrous race, or a non-human race, plus a human. Can you have a half-orc, half-halfling? A halfling and a half-orc. Well, maybe. Can you have a dwarf mixed with a drow, for example? Can you have a gnome that has bred with a halfling, giving you golf? I'm not sure. But the idea is that the mixing up of races, if we look at it from a genetic perspective, it's not very likely. On the other hand, if we look at it from a Star Trek perspective and we say that all sentient races were seeded from a single original DNA source, which accounts for why all the latex works so well, then interspecies breeding could happen. A halfling could quite happily breed with an orc or with a goblin to generate this weird little green short person. There's absolutely no reason why they couldn't do it. It's something for you to consider. And as I finish off, having done half-orcs and now having done half-elves, I want you to consider the ramifications of those mixtures. As a player, how would they affect life in that campaign world? And it boils down to, how does your GM treat those races? So as with half-orcs, with half-elves and half anything else, we have to consider what the GM has set up for us in terms of the cultures of those particular races. And you're going to see how it becomes so important. So when we look at half-elves, helfs as I call them, when we look at elves, we have to look at the idea of nature versus nurture. Now, within the role-playing games, generally speaking, nature triumphs nurturing. So races are ascribed being good races, evil races, neutral races, and it doesn't really matter whether the goblin is born in a goblin den or whether they're born in a castle. They will always be sneaky, mischievous, cunning, and trying to one-up their fellows. The idea that a dwarf will be anything but a dwarf is generally looked on as being kind of okay, but if you're a monstrous race, you're stuck with it. So the idea of elves, and elves are one of the few races that have been developed beyond just you're an elf. We've got high elves, we've got grey elves, we've got forest elves, we've got desert elves, we've got subterranean elves, ice elves. There's a variety, aquatic elves even. There's a variety of different elves that we have, which I really, really appreciate because, well, humans have diversified. Why can't other species as well? So when you're looking at your half-elf, you have to decide how much did they take on of the culture that they were born in versus how much do they take on from their natural biology. Now, a very good example of this is, for example, is the example that your half-elf has been raised by elves. Now, for sake of ease, let's say that these elves are traditional, high, imperious, long-lived elves who have a certain arrogance about them. They admire nature and beauty of mathematical music and symmetry, and they just really are a relaxed people who just live a long time. If your half-elf is raised in that kind of environment, how much of the human side is going to express itself? Now, when we look at this, the books even describe the two combinations. Humans are inventive, ambitious, they're curious. Elves are refined, love nature, and are artistic. That's not to say that humans are not artistic, love nature, and are refined. And it's also not to say that elves are not ambitious, curious, or inventive. But the idea is to say that the one is a lot less impulsive, a lot less determined to see the world, and is a lot happier with the environment that they're in, as opposed to the human side, which is a lot more interested and curious in what the world has to offer. So if you've decided that your elf is raised by other elves, your half-elf anyway, is raised by other elves, do they adopt the elvish approach? In which case then, how do you express to your fellow players that they are indeed a half-elf and not a true elf? Well, that's a negotiation you can have with the GM, depending on how the local elves see half-breeds. Some books say that the half-elf is looked upon by other elves as being an unfortunate mix with a lower species. Humans see half-elves as being a fantastic mix because they've got the wonderful natures of the elves plus the sensible, ambitious, curious nature of humans. So the humans will allow half-elves into their society, but elves will be a little bit less reluctant. Perhaps they're too pragmatic to worry about that sort of thing, but that's entirely up to your GM and to you to discuss. If it's about nurturing, then the argument could be made that your half-elf will pretend to be an elf and will embody everything that elves do, and will fight against any type of nature imposition that they might have, their human side, to laugh loudly and suddenly at something that's very funny, or to just pack up your things and head out the door tomorrow because you're curious as to what's on the other side of the hill. It's a good question to ask, and it is something for you to look at. Now, it is also not the focus of half-elves necessarily. It could be. Half-orcs have got the chip on their shoulder. Tieflings have got a chip on their shoulder. Half-elves really don't. If you look at them from the perspective of being human but not, they are the least pressured race, the least looked down upon, the least looked up to, the least... They just fit into this ideal space of being an ideal individual. And part of that is because of their beauty. They have bonuses to their charisma. They can approach both races. They can see the elvish side, they can see the human side, or the other half side. So half-elf, half-ling. They would be able to see both sides of that coin. Perhaps it would be even a better blend because you have these short people who appreciate nature, who appreciate sitting and talking, but also appreciate a good meal and a good feast and to have companionship. So it's not necessarily a very bad combination, if you ask me. Anyway, so the idea of this beauty that is ingrained into the half-elf, this charisma that just follows them wherever they go because of their elfin-like features as well as their human-like features. Now again, one could argue that today's modern society, especially where I am in Japan, the more effeminate the male, the more effeminate the female, the better they are from a beauty perspective. Whereas the hairier, the more square-jawed, the more rugged a man that one might be, the more masculinity one could argue from a historical context, the less desirable they are. Put us into a different country, in a different part of the world, say in Africa, where effeminate males are not looked on with a huge amount of awe or wonderment and are actually pushed to the sides, it's a different environment. But half-elves somehow manage to embody it and make everybody think that they are just absolutely wonderful. That is something that can be explored. A naturally charismatic race, a naturally charismatic space to be in. Is it something that you've explored before, and is it something that you've used to your advantage before? Now, we talk about beauty in the planet's context as this very localized kind of thing. What someone might find attractive here, someone else doesn't find attractive. What I find attractive is certainly not what you find attractive, for example. And thank goodness for that. It means that there is someone out there for us somewhere all over the planet. So how do we then quantify? Well, the game books quantify. That's what they do. They stamp, stereotype, and letterbox like you cannot believe. They have to in order to have a system of mechanics. So how do you then express that as a player? Do you play up your charismatic nature? The fact that you have these great qualities, these amazing cheekbones, this wonderful jawline, these very, very elegant ears, these amazing eyebrows that arch for days, as well as this delicate touch and this just slightly golden skin that looks perfectly radiant and remains so for centuries. That's something to think about. How do you portray that? How do you bring that to your game? And is it something that's important to bring to your game? I think it is. If you're playing a half-elf and you're not doing it just for the mechanics, but you're doing it for the narrative, that's something that I think is worth exploring, is the sense that everybody thinks that you're beautiful. How do you react when they don't? Now, enmity is quite a broad category. It talks about, and I've handled it a little bit, but enmity talks about how do other races perceive the half-elf, and how does the half-elf perceive other races? In some of the books, it talks about half-elves forming their own communities, and the reason for it is because when they form a relationship with a human, the human in the space of a mere 70 years, which is not even half the lifespan of a half-elf, will grow old, wither, and die. So as a person, I look at that and I go, I love pets. I loved my dogs, absolutely. Watching them getting old and dying is an incredibly tragic and incredibly painful process to go through. These are creatures that don't talk back, they don't have ambition, they don't talk to me about their future goals, they don't have children that educate and grow up and take on. They do to a certain degree, I absolutely understand, but there must be a stronger bond built between two sentient species that can have philosophical debates and argue and love and shout and hate and all those sort of things. To be a half-elf and to watch these humans grow up and die, you could go through 2 or 3 lifetimes. Dwarves and other long-lived races are going to have the same problem. The half-elf, though, is one of those who can appreciate it because they have their own human nature. They're also watching elves whom after 200 years haven't changed in an appearance. But the half-elf is now near the end of their life. So there must be this weird space of I live longer than you, but I live shorter than you. So building friendships with you, I can understand why you wouldn't want to do it. Building friendships with you, you have to understand why I don't want to do it. So it is an interesting space to sit in. You look at the shorter lived races and even other races like gnomes and halflings and things who live for a comparable amount of time. It's an interesting question. Exploration is another good point to look at. Now, how do you approach exploration? Is it from the elvish perspective, where it is gaining knowledge? Is it from the human perspective, where it's just getting out there and seeing what's out there and seeing what one can do and what one can participate in? It's another interesting question. Now, if you look at all four of these, there is something that is, I think, apparent and obvious, and that's why I didn't make a slide for it. This is a subtlety game. This isn't the half-orc who's vicious and then caring. This isn't the tiefling who's always downtrodden and always evil and looking around their shoulders in fear. This is something that's very human, has the potential to be very elf, but sits in between. So from a role-playing perspective, I think it's a fantastic opportunity to really explore those spaces, to shine a light on what it is to be elvish, to shine a light on what it is to be human. And to really unpack that idea is to bring these few little points, these issues, to light. And a lot of people might say, well, why would you bother? Why bother? The half-elf is an innocuous little race. It gives you some advantages. It's a cute idea to have this really sort of very pretty bunch of people wandering around. Well, I think that that's missing an opportunity for role-playing. If that's how you want to approach races, that's absolutely fine. But if you want to push it further, if you want to help the GM by coming up with plots where you want to go and explore a human city or an elvish city just to compare the differences, then this is a race for you, where you can do that, where you have that opportunity, where the race itself is prescribing certain things that you can go and explore and try and unpack and try and understand. Anyway, that's my 2 cents worth on half-elves, or helfs, as I like to call them. I love helfs. I think they're fantastic. Anyway, until next time, head on over to www.rpgtablefinder.com, where it's the website set up by our web goblin, who's not half anything. He is just pure genius. And he's set up this website where you can log in your details and then get found or find other players and GMs out there who conduct online games or even round the table games in your local neighborhood. It is something to go and have a look at. There's a huge community there now, and lots of groups are springing up almost every day. So go and have a look at that if you haven't already. Until next time, hit the like button, hit that subscribe button, and happy playing.